pertains to the National Park Service and Native peoples. And to really get into this, I have to give you some background. I have to give you some vocabulary. So we'll start with there first. So sites of relational significance is a way that I use to refer to sacred sites. And this is actually something that came out of a conversation I had with Clementine Bordeaux way back in grad school, because I wanted to talk about sacred sites, to write about sacred sites, but I felt like there was really a limitation with the vocabulary, because sacred to one person, might not mean the same thing to another person. And if we're thinking about sacred in different ways, particularly in this case, like Lakota people and people who aren't Lakota or people who are white, then that's going to lead to all kinds of confusion about what we're talking about and what we need and what we're trying to protect. So I'll start here with this chart I kind of made. And this is based off a sociologist named Emil Durkheim. He's actually considered to be like the father of sociology. So what you're seeing here is a very like Eurocentric, a very European view of what the word sacred means. So you can see right here, there's a separation right away. Sacred over on the left is, something that is set apart. It's supernatural, it's forbidden. So it's something that people don't interact with on a daily basis. And, that might mean God. That might mean the church, which has like a very sort of limited interaction with the public. Religion, you might need someone in between to help you communicate with God. It's not just a direct connection. And sacred is almost always thought of as, good. All things that are sacred are good things. On the other half, you have the profane. So those are things that, are part of your everyday life. So work is considered profane. This mouse, this is a very profane mouse right here. The earth, so since it's something that you interact with on a daily basis, that's profane. Sex is very profane because sex is bad, according to this. And, just like things that are bad in general are part of the profane. These two things cannot interact with each other, because if they do, one kind of taints the other. So the sacred should never come in contact with the profane. So, all the indigenous people who are watching this are probably like looking at this going, that's us, because it is. So I will, in a moment, I'll show you a better model, but I'm going to go into another word, which is waka, which is a Lakota word. And we use the word wakantaka when we're talking about like the creator. So basically, it gets used as God. One translation I see used a lot is the Great Spirit, which is always very strange to me because, waka, doesn't mean spirit. Like tanka means great, like something's big, but waka does not mean spirit, that's nagi. So I wanted to break down what this word meant, waka. And, we often say it's sacred. That's the translation we use. But really, when you break it down, you get the word ka in there, which means like a vein or an artery. So if you're thinking of a body, these are things coming out of your heart and reaching, the rest of your body, these arteries and, carrying the blood there. And wa is like a prefix. And it like basically changes a noun in a way to make it like there's a couple ways that it's will interact with a noun. So I have the word wakalyapi here, right? So that comes from the word kalyapi, which means that, they heat it up. But when you add the word wa onto it, it's, kind of defines and changes the noun into something else. So it's something that gets heated up, it becomes coffee. That's why we say wakaliapi. Um, if you add it to like the word yatkesa, which is like you're drinking habitually, wa yatkesa would be an alcoholic, right? So like the way I explain what the wa does is that the wa is the difference between this guy who is a Batman and this guy who is a Batman. So that's our wa. So when you're thinking about the word wakatanka, it's better to think about it as, a great vein, which I think is really in keeping with, this idea of, dakushkashka, this like spirit, this blue energy that runs through everything. That's our great vein there. That's our wakatanka. And you're probably already noticing, well, that's definitely not something that's separate from everything if it's running through everything. So we came up with this term, sites of relational significance. And what we wanted to do with that was, acknowledge that there was something happening in this space. So you can see like over on the left where we had sacred and over on the right where we had the profane, these things are now intersecting with one another. So that which is, that supernatural is intersecting with our everyday lives. And a site where this happens, or a quote unquote sacred site, it really is just a place where these things are the most powerful, where these fantastic events can occur, where like a human can be changed into a bison. Stories like that come from these sites of relational significance. And relational, the word relational just means our interaction and acknowledgement of everything around us, things that are human and things that are not human, or even, take the humans out of the equation, these other two things that are interacting, these, many things that are interacting with one another. This is the place where it's happening. So this is a quote that, really gets to me. So, Black Elk, of course, is, one of our great spiritual leaders. And, around the time that Badlands National Park was created, he was actually really bothered by this, not because he was bothered by the idea of protecting a space, because protection is important, but, bothered because of the separation that it implied. Badlands National Park, of course, is actually right on the border of the Pine Ridge Reservation. And in fact, part of the park is within the reservation itself. So I'll just read this quote to you. Once we were happy in our own country and we were seldom hungry, for the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds lived together like relatives. And there was plenty for them and for us. But the Washichus came and they have made little islands for us and other little islands for the four-legged. And always these islands are becoming smaller, for around them surges the nine flow of the Washichu. So he's talking about is, the creation of reservations and the creation of the reserves for animals as well. So these things are, separating human from animals, humans from nature. Now, to bring national parks into this, I want to talk a bit about the founding of national parks, which, was an idea that was really hatched in the 1800s. The guy who's first credited with coming up with the idea of national parks is this guy, George Catlin, who is a, famous painter, romantic painter from that time. And, he basically went on a boat ride down the Missouri River and he was looking around and he was seeing all this landscape and he was seeing tribes there. And he thought, oh my gosh, these things are going to disappear if we don't do something. So he wrote in his journal about the idea of a government policy creating a magnificent park. But, when he thought of this, he thought of, humans and animals. living together there. So he actually also thought of it as a place that would include native peoples as well. Because, the idea of what made something a wilderness at that time was really different from what we think of today. So during that time period, a wilderness was not considered to be an authentic wilderness unless it had native peoples in it. In fact, it was considered to be something called a comparative wilderness if it was just a place that preserved like landscape, but no native peoples in it. So, of course, this is the early 1800s. So, this is kind of the country's pretty young at this time. They are expanding. They've already started with, pushing some of the Eastern tribes outward, but they're not really like thinking like so big at this point. They're still thinking, oh, we can move the natives over here. And they're fine there. We're fine here for now. Oh, and I also apologize. I do live in an apartment complex, so there's going to be some yelling going on in the background. So I have this quote here from Luther Standing Bear. We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills, and the winding streams as wild. Not until the hairy man from the east came was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was that for us, the Wild West began. So, we're in the early 1800s. We have this idea that, a wilderness space is a place with people and with animals and with plants and all of them, and that these things can all exist together. However, that starts to change after the Civil War. And, what happens after the Civil War, the reason why this is significant is the country suddenly is in need of some kind of unifying factor. It, is no longer split, it is together. So it starts to look for things that are, representative of its national identity, like what makes us America, what makes us different from Europe, and what makes us want to be together as a country instead of separate. Of course, the country's landscapes were really seen as its form of ancient cathedral. The Americas, well, it didn't have, something like a European city. It did have these gorgeous landscapes. So those things are really what people started to, highlight and advocate for the protection of those landscapes. Also, they had previously had, enemies, like the enemy was the North or the enemy was the South. And now they needed new enemies. So, Native people kind of became that scapegoat. This quote that I included here is from a guidebook called the Parks and Mountains of Colorado in 1868. And here's someone just like writing a park guide talking about how, Native peoples are, victims, the victim of our destiny is the term they use. Ours to displace, ours to protect. So weird things going on there. So basically, you're taking on a very paternalistic view. The natives, they need to be removed. But, also we need to take care of them. We have some kind of moral obligation to do that. They call this expansion with honor. So basically, we need to somehow get rid of the natives, but in a way that's honorable, So assimilation at that time was considered to be, the most honorable way to do it. But, they preferred removal because, partially because it was easier for them, but also because they couldn't accept the idea of a Native person as a fellow citizen, sharing these rights and also sharing land claims. So it was just, easier and legally quicker for them just to move the natives on out. And this this is funny. This was not the only guidebook I found that had quotes like this. There was another book called The California and Oregon Trail by Francis Parkman that was just so awful in the way it talked about Native peoples that Herman Melville wrote a review of it. He wrote, "When in the body of the book, we are informed that it is difficult for any white man to hold Indians much more than brutes. We are told too that to such a person, the slaughter of an Indian is as indifferent as the slaughter of a buffalo." So this is kind of like the national psyche at this time. And Melville even writes a whole book about it called The Confidence Man, which, he talks about the metaphysics of Indian hating during this time period. So we start in the early 1800s. We're thinking of the wilderness as a space with, Native peoples. And now as we're moving past the Civil War, suddenly Native peoples are the enemy. They've got to go. And it's within this environment that we see the birth of our national parks. So keep in mind the previous quote was in 1868. So this one follows on the heels of that, 1872. That's when we get our first national park, which is Yellowstone. Another important note is that 1872 is the year after the United States stops making treaties with Native peoples. So the treaty era ended officially in 1871. So where we are now, we're moving towards the end of the relocation era, maybe 10, 15 years, I'll say 15 years later, we're going to get into the allotment and the assimilation era. So what we're doing is right now, we're kind of in an intersection of spaces in terms of Indian policy. So at that time, when we had this first national park created, we did not have a National Park Service. The National Park Service wouldn't come until the 1916 Organic Act. So really, they just kind of had to find people that they trusted to be, the superintendents of these parks. Now, Yellowstone National Park is really interesting, for a lot of reasons, but for one, it kind of creates the mythos of the national park. And for the longest time, if you looked up, the founding of Yellowstone, what you would find was almost like a fairy tale about how it was founded. So there was this thing, this expedition into Yellowstone, and it was called the Langford Expedition. So it was just like this group of like professionals, and they were like a mixture of like kind of rough and tumble people and lots of really rich guys going into Yellowstone. And according to the myth, one of the lawyers, like one night they were sitting around a campfire and they were going, "Oh, I want that piece of land. And I want that piece of land." But then this lawyer, Cornelius Hedges, said, "Well, no, there should be no private ownership of this land. We should preserve this land for everyone." So, this other guy on the mission, Langford, just really loved that idea. And after the expedition, he went around the country touring on behalf of Yellowstone National Park and really advocating for it. And, as a result, when he was able to achieve that goal, when Yellowstone National Park was created, he became the first superintendent of it. Did you believe any of that? Like I said, it's a bit of a fairy tale. Truth be told, Nathaniel Langford, the guy the expedition is named after, the first superintendent of the national park, was acting in his own interests. He actually worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And, at this time, Yosemite already existed as a state park. And, the railroad company, the first Continental Railroad, was really like a big success. So the Northern Pacific said, "Well, we want in on that." So Langford, what can you do for us? And so they hatched this idea to get Yellowstone created as a national park so that they could get the government to fund it, to get an exclusive contract so that Northern Pacific Railroad would be the only ones who would have access and who could like get this really profitable railroad in there. Um, so like it's a little more nefarious than originally than at first glance than as the Park Service used to tell it. And he did become the first superintendent. That part is true. He only went to Yellowstone twice in like his whole tenure, and I think no, I won't say. I think he ended up in some legal trouble, but I don't know too much about that. So just move on. So immediately they run into a problem. And that is because, when they took this 2 million acres of land out of the public domain, they said, okay, there's going to be no settlement, no occupancy, or no sale of this land. But they didn't think about the fact that the land was already occupied. And there were several tribes that actually, lived in this place. The Tukudeka were the sheep eaters, is how that translates. They were a Shoshone band that lived in Yellowstone National Park year round. Like that was their homelands. You also see, it borders Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. So you had the Nez Perce who came in there. You had lots of different Shoshone bands who came in here, like the Bannock. And you also have the Crow tribe. And in fact, the image I've got displayed right here is the Crow boundaries from the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. So you can see that goes through half of Yellowstone National Park. And they didn't think about that at all when they created the park. So now suddenly they had an Indian problem, right? So first thing they got to do is they got to somehow get rid of these native peoples who are in their national park. And the reason why I'm showing the Crow lands here is because the sheep eaters, the ones who lived in Yellowstone, they weren't present at the negotiations of the 1851 treaty. Like they got left out of that totally, so they couldn't even advocate for themselves. So the story I told about Mr. Langford, part of the way that they started to work on getting rid of natives from the park is like first, they spread rumors that, when they went there, they never saw any signs of natives, like they weren't even there. When in fact, their own journals showed that on day one, they encountered the Crow while they were going in there. Another day they were like going off trail and they found like some teepee rings and they're like, oh, let's get out of here. But, they just decided to ignore all those things. So now they have a national park in 1872. And by 1877, the Crow, who, are still very much in this area and very much using this area, are, going into Yellowstone so frequently that their Indian agent got worried. He was saying, oh, they're not assimilating. They are still going into the mountains. And he said that they were starting to differ little from all the wild tribes of the mountains who know nothing of their straits of civilization. So the Crow are very much using this land still. But then something starts to happen, which is you have miners, as in miners, moving into the area. You have ranchers, you have people doing commercial hunting in the area, and suddenly this valley area, which is in the northeastern part of Yellowstone, just suddenly starts to get scarce. And now the Crow can't use it so much for their hunting. In 1880, the park superintendent, his name was Superintendent Norris. So the superintendent of Yellowstone, he goes to a meeting between the Crow representatives and the federal government specifically to tell them, hey, we don't want the Crow in Yellowstone anymore. But at that time, the Crow really weren't in much of a position to advocate for themselves because they were really like fractured as a tribe. They had this leader named Blackfoot, and he passed away, and suddenly there was like just disconnect and disagreement. So, the US government used that opportunity to get the Crow to cede part of their reservation. And it was 6 band chiefs who made that decision. And so the Crow were moved out of Yellowstone completely. In 1879, Superintendent Norris found the last of the sheep eaters, and he had them escorted down to the Wind River Reservation. So now Yellowstone doesn't have any native peoples anymore. And it's actually the first example of natives being removed from a space in order to preserve wilderness. Again, like 50 years ago, that would have been unheard of. They are part of the wilderness, but now, given the attitudes of the country, they have to be removed in order for this wilderness to be protected. So I want to talk a little bit more about this myth of disuse, because for a fact, we know that every crown jewel, which is every gigantic park that you can think of in the national park system, is a relational site. It is a sacred site to Native peoples. So, this myth of disuse really became part of, the method of, just disinheriting them from this land. In Yellowstone, they said that the site is sacred to the Native peoples who live there. So therefore it's avoided. Like that's why you never see Native peoples in Yellowstone, because they're so scared of that and they respect the sacred so much that, they're not going to go near it. Again, it's this right here, because sacred is something that Europeans think of as an entirely separate thing. Well, they're saying, oh yeah, it's sacred. Natives aren't going there. And in fact, Superintendent Norris actually lies about native use in the park. In his first, annual report of the park, he says that native peoples are too scared to come into the park. And that actually becomes part of, the literature at Yellowstone, until very recently, actually way too recently, would, if you asked a ranger at Yellowstone, they would say, oh yeah, native peoples never came in here. And it wasn't just at Yellowstone that they did this. It also happens, at many other places, particularly this place that you see in the picture, which is Glacier National Park, which is home to the Blackfeet people. So one of the early advocates of the park, his name was George Grinnell. He came to the park and he actually had a Blackfoot guide lead him, through the trails, all these foot trails through the park. And then he got in and he said, wow, look at this absolutely virgin ground. No one's ever been here. Meanwhile, he just expertly got led there by a Blackfeet person. So there's a little bit of weird psychology going on here. In fact, half of Glacier at that time was part of the Blackfeet reservation. So he goes, oh, well, they might own it, but they don't use it. It's sacred. This is where one of their, creation stories take place, because the Blackfeet called it the backbone of the world. And he's like, well, they respect that too much. They don't go in there. So they're not going to mind if we buy it, right? So that's, what they tried. And the Blackfeet were not having it. And, this guy kind of ingratiated himself amongst the Blackfeet. So they really trusted him. And he's like, don't worry, I'll help you negotiate. Don't worry about it. The Blackfeet said, well, you know what the government's offering? Give us 3 times that and they can use the rocks. And he's like, no, no, don't, no, 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 that's bad. Don't do that. You're just, screwing yourself over. And what was also happening at this time was, more people who wanted to mine the mountains were coming in. So you have settlers, you have miners coming into the area. And so George Grinnell said to the Blackfeet, the government can't protect you right now from these people coming into your lands. But if you sell this land and it becomes part of the national parks, then the government can protect you. And so, eventually the Blackfeet did agree to that. But they were under the impression that they were only selling the rocks once again. So their impression was that, yes, the National Park Service, not the National Park Service, the government would own the rocks, but the Blackfeet would continue to use the land. And they actually insisted on that. They said, we get to use the land forever, even though you're making a national park here. And actually, the government agreed, but when they crafted the Glacier National Park Act, they didn't mention anything about that in there. So again, this whole idea of disuse, which is, absolutely ridiculous, this idea that because something's sacred, it doesn't get used. It's funny, like in the case of Yellowstone, is that land was so used that those tribes actually used the geysers to cook food in. Like that's how unafraid of the geysers they were. And, they actually shaped the land with fire as well. So they were an integral part of this. But again, no one believes that. Because how could you possibly want to interact with the sacred? How could you set fire to something that's sacred, right? There's a funny little anecdote about Yosemite, which is that the first party that went into the first, European American party that went into Yosemite, they came into the land and they looked at, how big the trees were and how perfectly spaced they were and how there was like almost no tinder and no brush on the ground because, the Yosemite tribe had been shaping that land with fire. They looked at it and they went, wow, God is amazing. God just crafted this perfect land that's almost like a garden. Wow, how did he do that? This is incredible. Again, not thinking that, native peoples would ever step foot in a place like that. So I've been talking a lot about other tribes, but because we are Lakota centric here, we'll bring it back to us. Because a lot of these, concepts that I've brought up are relevant to the Lakota in the Black Hills. Of course, to give like a very brief history, in 1851 is when the Lakota entered into a legal relationship with the US government, and that was done at Fort Laramie. And you can see at the bottom left, right there in Wyoming, you can see Fort Laramie, which is also a national park site, by the way. So that's when, the 1851 treaty went and where it happened. And then later on, the 1868 treaty was negotiated at the same place. What's really important about the 1868 treaty was Article 12, which states that land cannot be ceded unless it's agreed to by 3/4 of the adult male members of the tribe. In 1874, however, General Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills. And, while he's on that expedition, they're saying, oh, it's to scout a fort, which the treaty did give them the right to do. Like Article 2 says that they can scout native lands to put up forts. So they said, oh, it's for a fort. And they go to scout the Black Hills. But like weirdly, they brought geologists with them, which, again, sus. Um, and so the geologists specifically made reports about like how much gold they found in the Black Hills. Some of them said, oh, there's not really any, but others said, well, there's enough here. So, before like the mission was even over, newspapers around the country were reporting that there could be paying amounts of gold found in the Black Hills. So of course, you get thousands, literally thousands of miners coming into the Black Hills into, this treaty guaranteed territory. And, they're invading the land. The army didn't do, the US Army didn't do very much to try to stop them. It was kind of like slap on the wrist stuff. And then by 1875, the public was actually saying, well, why did they get the land? Because they actually don't use the land. They don't go in there. We've never seen them in there. So they must not use it. Therefore, give it to someone who will. Again, like this non-usage claim comes in. 1876, of course, is when the Battle of the Little Bighorn occurs. General Custer is killed. And then in 1877, and the timing of this, again, it's really significant, is when they passed the Act of 1877, which is colloquially known as the Sell or Starve Act. I really disagree with that name because the land wasn't actually sold, but that's how the option was presented to the Lakota people. Essentially, they said, you're going to run out of rations. There's no bison here for you to hunt anymore. If you sell us this land, we'll give you rations. How about that? Otherwise, you can just starve. And, some people were convinced, but only about 10% of the adult male population. And if you remember in Article 12 of the 1868 treaty, you need 75%. They didn't have it, but they went ahead and pushed it through anyway. So, this is what opens up the Black Hills to mining operations. And really just reduces the size of the reservation massively. And of course, we get the Dawes Act as well, which also opens the land up. So to talk a little bit about the Black Hills and why they're so important. So, we always talk about how the Black Hills are the heart of everything, and they really are, but how important they are to Lakota people. Yes, and there are actually dozens of tribes that have history using the Black Hills, and that's something that doesn't really get talked about as much because of the space where the Black Hills are located. They were actually a really important trade site. So this is a site here where many, many tribes would come to meet, where they'd exchange information. This is like your New York Times of the world right here, where people are just talking, learning about what's going on everywhere else. So, they're important for that reason. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arikara, Crow, Hidatsa, Kiowa, Arapaho, Mandan, Ponca, Apache, all of them. It's a big party here. Everyone was coming. Within the Black Hills, wait, I want to go back to this one first, because I just want to really quick point out the map on the right. I love this map. Geology, man, it's so cool. Okay, I'll get off that. Okay, so right here we have a map that was published in, it's actually a National Park Service publication called Passages Through Many Worlds, a historic resource study of Wind Cave National Park. So if you look at this map, you can see that, not only, it's not just one site in the Black Hills that is considered to be a sacred site, it's all of these sites. And actually we've got at least 20, not even like all pictured here, but we've got at least 20 sites within the Black Hills that fall into that designation of a sacred site. Another quote from Luther Standing Bear. How long the Lakota people lived in these Midwest plains bordering the Black Hills before the coming of the white man is not known in tribal records. But our legends tell us that it was hundreds and perhaps thousands of years ago since the first man sprang from the soil in the midst of these great plains. So this land of the Great Plains is claimed by the Lakotas as their very own. We are of the soil, and the soil is us. It's beautiful. So the Lakota have this, really deep connection to these lands, to the Black Hills. And, the whole area really is one of these places, these sites of relational significance. Lakota people are not the only tribe to consider this place sacred as well. That's important to remember. But as far as I know, we're the only tribe that says that this site right here, the Black Hills, is where we were born. It's our creation story, it's our emergent story. So I want to talk a little bit about Wind Cave National Park. Wind Cave, of course, is located in the southern Black Hills, you can see. And Wind Cave, is an important site spiritually for Lakota people. But before I even get there, I'm going to tell you a bit about Wind Cave. So Wind Cave became a national park in 1903. And it's actually one of the oldest national parks there is. And, a lot of people don't realize that this is one of the major ones. It's the very first national park that was created to protect a cave because, even people who weren't Lakota came to this place and understood how, important it was. And, the story about like the white settling of Wind Cave is just, there were some people who came and the McDonald family, and they tried to mine it, but of course it didn't have any minerals that they wanted. There's no gold in it because Wind Cave is primarily within the limestone layer. Back to that geology, the limestone layer of the Black Hills. So they really felt that, they could maybe make a living as tour guides there, like leading people through the cave. Another family came in and joined them on that venture. They started a whole company, and eventually they just fought over the cave so much that the US government stepped in and said, mine now. You guys are fighting too much, so we'll just take this. We'll take care of it. Currently, the cave is measured at 149 miles long, which is incredible. It's one of the longest caves in the world. And they think they've only mapped about anywhere from 5 to 10% of it. So I want you to think about how big this cave is. It's also considered to be the most complex cave in the world. It's what's called a maze cave. So, instead of like thinking of it as like the cave starts here, ends here, point A to point B, it's actually more like the cave goes here and here and here and here and here and here and here, all over. It's like a big bowl of spaghetti. It's just complicated. Yeah. So The cave is, really important to the Lakota people because it is the site of our emergence story. And I've actually heard like a bunch of different names for the cave. I've the one an elder told me was the oldest name of the cave was Oníya Ošóka, which means like a heavy kind of thick breath. I've heard it called Maka Onie, which is a breathing earth. Um, Oníya Ošóka, which is like a cave that's breathing. Makoche Oklokka, which is like a cave homeland. And then, like, I've heard the entrance called Wasun Nie as well. So we've got all of these different, names for this place. And, you know, the story essentially, and I'm gonna make this real short because this is a long story. And the first place I learned the story was from Wilmer Mesteth, who was one of our tribal elders. Um, and he actually he taught in the Lakota Studies Department at Oglala Lakota College. Such an incredible source of knowledge, and he actually taught an oral history class. So that's where I learned this, and that was really life changing for me to be able to hear these stories from an elder like that. But the story essentially goes that, a long time ago, there were two spirits that were living on the earth because they'd been banished there. So one was Iktomi and the other was Anagite, which is the double-faced woman. And Iktomi is just always playing tricks on Anagite, and she hates him. And Iktomi's kind of bored because she's like always got the same reactions. And then one day, Iktomi thinks about it, and he remembers that there's people, living in this place called the Tonka Teepee, which is like the lodge of the spirits. And Iktomi decides, well, hey, if we get them out of there, we can like have new people to play tricks on. So he tells us to Anagite, and he says, well, if you do that, if you help me, then I'm not going to bother you anymore. And she's like, cool, I got you. So they send a wolf down into the cave, and the cave you can think of as a passageway almost. And the way that the Tonka Teepee is described is interesting because it sounds like almost like a type of portal into the spirit world. But like, just to pause the story a moment, that really that was really interesting to me because going back to the geology nerdery of the Black Hills, the way the Black Hills were formed was through a geologic event. And it was the same event that created the Rocky Mountains. So you have plates colliding underground, and there's a layer of granite, and then there's a layer of limestone, and other stuff, but limestone's the most important one on top of that. And like, as these plates are pushing together, you've got the granite pushing upwards and breaking the limestone around it. And so this limestone develops these giant cracks in it. And if you look back, let me go here, you can see that there's a center of the Black Hills. There's a geologic center to them. And that's at Black Elk Peak, which is on the map as Harney Peak because it's an old map. So that was like where everything centered up at. So this is the highest point. And if you think of the limestone around it, it's cracked around it, you have all of these giant cracks in the ground going towards the center of the Black Hills. And actually, you can imagine that as a teepee with poles going to the center. So I always thought that was really cool, like the idea of the Tonka teepee in the Black Hills. And also theoretically, like many of the cave systems in the Black Hills could be connected. Like you can have some giant cave systems there that we don't know anything about. And just think of how big Wind Cave is, and that's just a small, tiny little portion of the Black Hills. So to get back to the story, they go, the wolf goes into the passageway and finds the tungka tipi and convinces some of the people that he meets there to come follow him. And, most of the people said, no, like, that's, you're sus, get out of here, wolf. But the wolf's like, hey, but look at all these things I brought with me. And he's got like berries, and he's got like really nice leather clothes, and he's like buckskin clothes, and he's got like dried meat. And so they try it and they're like, oh, that meat's pretty good. Okay. All right, I trust you instantly. And he leads them up to the surface, some of the people. Again, the rest stayed behind. So once they're up there on the surface, they meet Anagite, and her name means double face, and she's got like a horrible face and a beautiful face, and she's got her horrible face hidden. So she's got like a shawl. She's like, "Hey, here, here's stuff. Here's how to do stuff. Here's how you survive." And they're like, "Cool." So they like try to survive, make their own clothes, get their own food, but it's like really hard work. And they're not like, they're getting so tired doing it. And, life wasn't like this in the Tumpan Tipi at all. Like, it was easy. So like when winter comes, they're like, oh no, we don't have enough food and our clothes aren't warm. What do we do? So they go back to Anagite and they like ask her for more help. But then they say she pulls off her shawl and shows her horrible face, and she laughs at them with it. And they're so scared, they try to go back, to the hole, to that hole that they came from. But when they get there, Iktomi has covered it and hidden the way back in. So they just sit down on the ground and they start to cry. And as they're crying, as they're wailing, the creator hears them, asks what's wrong, and they tell the story, but they're not supposed to have come out that early, and they kind of have to deal with the consequences of their actions. And if you like a lot of the Ihani stories, the stories about like spirits, they talk about that a lot. Like the reason why Iktomi is banished is on the earth is because he played a trick. So he was banished so that he could play tricks forever. And Anagite hid her intentions, so she's double face forever. So like a lot of these stories, there's a theme of like having to live with the consequences of your actions. And so these people had to live with the consequences of their actions as well. And then in the next part of the story, the next group of people come out, and as they're coming out, they stop 4 times, and then they make their way to the surface. And when they get here, they see this really beautiful landscape, Wind Cave. It's just gorgeous. And they also see bison hoof prints on the ground, because what the creator has done is the creator has decided, to kind of take pity on these people who came out early but who couldn't survive. So the creator turned them into bison so that they could survive. And so the second wave of people, they see those bison hoof prints and they follow them. And the creator tells them, the bison will give you everything you need to live. So, the Lakota people, we have that story at this place. And, that's not just our birthplace, that's the birthplace of the bison as well. So, it becomes doubly an important place. This is the place, the Southern Black Hills, where, every winter the bison would return to. So the Lakota people would follow them as well. So, it's a place we have a lot of connection with. Now, we can say we consider it a sacred site, and that means one thing to us, but that means something very different and very legal to the government. So Wind Cave is actually officially considered to be a sacred site by the government. And, that is made possible by this executive order 13007. So a sacred site, if you wanted to know, is any specific, discrete, narrowly delineated location on federal land that is identified by an Indian tribe or Indian individual determined to be appropriately authoritative, representative of an Indian religion as sacred by virtue of its established religious significance or ceremonial use by an Indian religion, provided that the tribe or appropriately authoritative representative of an Indian religion has informed the agency of the existence of such a site. Okay, did you catch all that? Here it is. A sacred site is something that's contained. It is designated, it is legal, and it's historically been used by religion, but it's not currently used because it's on federal land. So there's a lot of problems with this definition, as you can see. I mean, first of all, even though this, this exists, even though we have, legislation that says that park sites have to consult with Native tribes, they don't have to do anything the Native tribes tell them to. That's the catch in all of this. You can consult. Yes, they have to consult. They don't have to listen to you. Second, there's a lot of issues. Like, first of all, a sacred site is on a specific, discrete, narrowly defined, delineated location on federal land. So if your sacred site's on private land, guess what? It's not sacred. But also it's like got a boundary, a specific boundary. So, if you wanted to go over to your sacred site and draw a boundary around where it's sacred and where it stops being sacred, like you step over here, no, it's not sacred anymore. Also, you need an authority, which is, good. Not just anyone can say that it's a sacred site, but the thing is that authority has to be recognized by the federal government. So while it seems like it's acknowledging, our knowledge and everything, but it's also saying, but only because we say so. And it doesn't apply to everyone. Not everyone who is Native is considered to be Native by the federal government. That's a big issue in itself. I mean, how many people do you know who are definitely part of, your family or your friend's family, but they're not enrolled, they're not legally Indian, so they don't get a voice in this? Or how many tribes, like the sheep eaters in Yellowstone, for example, just weren't important enough, or the federal government didn't care enough about them to have, treaty relationships with them. So, there's so many problems with letting the federal government define, who can speak for a tribe, what a tribe is, and, what is sacred. So now we get to the hardest question. How do we get to this point? How do we gain access back to these places? How do we regain land? And honestly, there's no easy answer to this because there are so many different approaches. One person can't do it. I certainly can't just barge into Congress and say, hey, give us back the Black Hills. That's not going to happen. But, also the superintendent of Wind Cave National Park can't say, oh, you're right, here you go, have Wind Cave back. He doesn't have that power either. Or she doesn't have that power either. So, what can we even do? Well, first, we identify, what needs to be addressed in national parks. Number one, erasure of Native peoples, because that's a tactic that has been used to keep Native peoples out of these spaces, to keep them from coming back. The way the National Park Service is seen by the US population, there's Honestly, the National Park Service is seen very positively by the US population. Like, it's not even like a political identity thing. It's just crazy because everything is, done by political identities. But no, everyone likes national parks. They see national parks as, the stewards of, our quote unquote sacred and sacred in the everyone sense land. Because like nowadays a lot of non-native people would even describe park sites as sacred, but they mean it in a certain way. So how do we get back native peoples as stewards as well? How do we address loss of land, and how do we address loss of access to resources, to our spiritual sites? So these are all big questions that we have to find individual ways to tackle. And which brings me to what I have personally decided to do, and is probably the most controversial part of this presentation. I became a park ranger. And I started working for the National Park Service. I got my first job as a park ranger at Wind Cave National Park. There's me inside the cave, just walking with some perfect lighting, because that always happens. And I actually got the job almost by accident, because even though I grew up near where Wind Cave is, I did not know it was a national park. I mean, I knew it was a place. I didn't really like have a conception though of like what rangers were and what the National Park Service was. Actually, I lived in Wounded Knee for years. You think I knew Badlands was a park and not just the way things look when you drove to Rapid City? No. So yeah, so like first of all, there's this problem where like Native peoples maybe don't have, you know, much, they don't feel the same way about national parks that like non-native peoples do. Like white people, for example, they see national parks as, these are our parks, this is our heritage, these are our public places. And the native view of national parks is very different, because yes, they are our parks, you're right. They are our spaces, you're right. Oh wait, you were talking about you. So it's complicated. A lot of native peoples don't even feel welcome when they go to spaces like this. And, it's not hard to see why. This is a picture, an early picture. When I first started working at Wind Cave, I took this picture because this panel on the wall was the earliest panel they had for the history of the park. And I don't think they mention Native peoples whatsoever. So history begins in 1881 in this park. When I first arrived, there was a timeline on the wall. And again, it began at 1881. And then it said, before that, it said prehistory, Native Americans discover a breathing hole in the ground. And that was all. I was like, dang, not a lot happened before 1881, huh? This right here is where you wait to get a tour of the cave. And I'm just showing you this kind of so you can follow a little path as you get out to the natural entrance. So that's the visitor center right there. This is where you wait for a tour of the cave, and then you walk north to the natural entrance. Now it's unfair to say that there was like nothing about Native peoples when I started, because there was this. They installed it the year before I got there. And this is really interesting. This came out of a meeting of, TIPOs, tribal representatives, and, Wind Cave National Park. You can see there's only 5 tribes that participated, when there's actually like over 20 that are associated with the site. So kind of a narrow view of the site. And also, the Lakota Nation in particular, I love that. We're not the only ones, I hate to admit it, but other people found this place important too, but hey, that's what happens when Lakota people show up to the consultation meetings. I asked about the bison. I said, "What's up with this bison?" And the the guy who worked at the park told me, "Well, as we were leaving the meeting, one of the reps said, 'Hey, that kind of looks like a bison. Can you put that on there too?'" And they did. And I was like, "No, okay, cool. It looks like a bison, but it's a little bit of a sloppy way to go about creating this new signage." Um, so I had work to do. Now, what really compelled me to like really do something, because I was just a seasonal employee. I was the lowest level you could be at that park. I led tours through the cave. But, I noticed, first of all, this lack of representation about Lakota history, Black Hills history, and just like the significance of the cave. Because even if you don't talk about the emergence story, you can talk about Custer, you can talk about Crazy Horse, you can talk about Red Cloud. There's a rich history of this area you can talk about without getting into any spiritual aspect of it. So, I figured, well, we needed a whole overhaul of what was happening. And what really compelled me to do this was one day another ranger came up to me and he goes, "Hey, I'm going to have one Lakota person on my tour group." And they actually asked at the front desk if, they could have a ranger who would talk about the emergence story. And I was wondering if you could take my tour, and I'll take your tour, but can you take mine? And I was like, yeah, I mean, you should know this, but because you work here, but yeah, I'll do it. Fine. So I took his tour, took the group down into the cave, had a really lovely conversation with this person who they weren't Lakota. They were just interested. So, but I had a great time talking to them, came out, and then I waited for his tour, which was running 15 minutes later than mine. He comes out, and I go talk to him and I'm like, "Hey, how's it going? How'd your tour go?" Because I wanted to tell him about mine. And he goes, "Oh my God, they were all Lakota." So, in trying to avoid his responsibility in learning about, the cave's story, he just walked himself into a bigger mess than he, had been in. So, more of that theme of living with the consequences of your choices. Am I right? Um, that said, what I heard from rangers a lot was, the reason I don't talk about it was that it's not my story to tell. And, that always really upset me because the history of this country is your story to tell. The history of dispossession is your story to tell. The history of the Black Hills is your story to tell. The land claim, the dispossession. There's a reason why you're standing here, and it's your story to tell. So don't cop out, buddy. So the first thing I did was I set up a formal training for the rangers at the park. And it was actually, this is the last time I did the training. It was 2019, but I started in 2014. So that's how long this has been going on. And I basically decided that they needed just the basics at the very least. Another thing that was happening was we would get like random groups who would come in and kind of protest the park on behalf of the Lakota people. And, they would have no idea, like the Rangers would have no idea why. Like they just thought these were some randomly aggressive people. And you have to be like, no, they're here for a reason. You just got to understand what that reason is. So we had to correct some of what they did. So here's my index. These are all the topics that I decided that I wanted them most to know about. sacred sites of relational significance are on there as well. Gave them some basic terminology, talked about the history. And then we redesigned this panel in the museum, or we added this panel in the museum as well, just so we could start somewhere and get this, history on the wall. Now, another thing that we did, which was very important to me, was we consulted with elders. So primarily the people I talked to were Wilmer Mesta, then Carol Iron Rope Herrera, and Phyllis Swifthawk. And, two of those people have passed away since, so I'm really glad that I got to talk to them about this. And we were talking about the timeline on the wall and like how we could represent Lakota history, as well. And the first thing they told me was, don't do a timeline, because that linear way of thinking is, the way white people think. So we don't think like that. So we can't do a timeline the way they do. So, they told me, think about winter counts, traditional ways of sharing history. So we got this piece right here commissioned by Martin Red Bear. We just handed him a copy of the emergent story as told by Wilmer and said, go for it. So he's got all the details on here. And here it is as seen in the visitor center. So it's a really beautiful piece that I absolutely enjoy. Another thing that we did was we started doing outreach, because the thing is, I was the only Lakota person who worked there, and that was a problem. So we were going to LNI. If you go to LNI, you might see Wind Cave has a booth set up there every year. We started going to the Oglala Lakota Nation powwow, and we actually did that in conjunction with the Forest Service as well. Here's my picture on the left. It's me hanging out with Smokey Bear. And then on the right, there's a picture of me with an eagle. So there's my bear and eagle. No. Okay. I thought it was funny. Just park ranger things right there. But on the left, that's us at Ognash. So, that was a lot of fun. I introduced my coworkers to Indian tacos for the first time. They were never the same. And of course, we try our best to, encourage, Native peoples to apply every year. So they decided the best way to do that was to put my picture on the flyer. No, I don't know why they did that. They just really like me, I guess. You can see one of my pop-ups in the background there called the Porcupine Fashion Show. And that's where I taught about making quill work. So that's what those kids are learning. They're learning what things you use to make dyes for quill work that you can find in the park. So a big part of changing how a park does, its interpretation is the long-range interpretive plan. Now I use the word interpretation, and you might think that means translating, which in a way it does, because what an interpreter does, and in the Park Service, our park rangers are the interpreters. So what an interpreter does is they translate the history, the culture, everything of that site in a way for it to make sense to visitors. So we teach about the land. We teach about why this place is important to us. And, the kind of things we talk about are defined in the long-range interpretive plan. So if you want to change what a park emphasizes, what a park finds important, then this is the place where you got to go. So this is something that we're working on, is creating a new long-range interpretive plan that, includes the Lakota and other tribal connections to the park. We're also working on redesigning the visitor center and museum spaces. This is an old schematic that I've got here. But you can see, we're trying to make sure we're actively highlighting tribal connections in places in our museum. Right here, they actually did a commission for an artist to do some kind of representation of the emergent story that spans 2 stories. And they've commissioned a Lakota artist to do that, so that's great. So ignore the weird designs on that sculpture that are somehow very Southwestern. That's not what it's going to be. That's just, that's just guesses, I guess. Some reference images for, the kinds of things that they want to do. And also like not just, not just the emergent story, but also the story of the Great Race, all kinds of other things. So we're not trying to keep, the Lakota story just to one section, but, have it span throughout the visitor center. The funny thing is we've been working on this for years, having tribal consultations over and over again to get these designs to where we had them. And then we had a tribal consultation where a bunch of the Cheyenne nations were able to attend, the Cheyenne representatives. And so we had these giant pictures on the wall about like the emergent story and about, the Great Race and everything. And the Cheyenne representatives really look around and they go, seems like you're only talking about the Lakota, huh? And they're like, we were supposed to have a reservation in the Black Hills. And I said, man, I know where you're coming from. I agree. But only Lakota people showed up to the meetings. So that's a problem. And this is the results. Which, brings me to my conclusion. We have so many ways that, we're going to tackle these issues. And a lot of people, I'm sure, are going to disagree with me working for the Park Service. And I've gotten that question before from white people, actually, weirdly enough, is like, do people see you like in a weird way, like this by working for the federal government? And I said, oh, some people might, I don't know. I've never encountered someone who said that. But, the way that I think of it is that everyone has their own talents. Everyone has access to different types of knowledge, different resources, and we do what we can with what we have. So, while I'm not actively bursting into Congress saying, give back the Black Hills, and I don't think that would be effective, what I did do was every day I led 120 people through the cave. So that's 5 days a week, 120 people. And I worked there for 6 months out of the year. So and every time I led a group through the cave, I told them about the dispossession of the Black Hills. I told them that these were our sacred lands, and I told them why. I told them about the connection we had to this place. So that quickly adds up to thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And I worked at that place for 5 years, who learned that history from me directly. So, we're limited in the things we can do, but it adds up. And, I really encourage you to tap into your own power, the things that you can do personally, and, just see what kind of changes that you can affect. A little more on the complicated, actions that we take. A couple of years ago, I went to the 150th commemoration of the Fort Laramie Treaty at Fort Laramie National Historic Site. And, it was a big event. All of the tribes who had, signed that treaty were invited. And the superintendent of the park got up and, he was very emotional. And he talked about how those meetings with tribal representatives had changed his life, and he was like crying on stage. And he really stressed the importance of working with tribal partners as the Park Service. But that guy, he couldn't have changed anything. He could not have given the parks back to the people, but he did what he could by listening. So he did what was within his power. Who also spoke that day was Roy Brown, who is a chairman from the Apache Nation. And he told a little story, and I thought that was really, really profound. So I want to read what he said that day. And this is about, the people who signed the Fort Laramie Treaty. He said, "This morning I sat outside in the sun, kind of to warm up, but also I wanted to help myself get a better understanding of what my ancestors went through, of what they were feeling 150 years ago. I sat there, the sun rays coming down on me, and I listened. And I know they felt anguish. This wasn't our first time. We had been here before. We suffered through this before. I know they had distrust. They were frustrated. They were angry. But I think through all of that, there was hope. They sat here with the other leaders from the other tribes, hoping for a better future for our young ones, for their young ones. And it's through the hope came resiliency and courage. And it is those things, that's how we can say we are still here." So that's how I want to conclude this, is to say, do what you can because you are still here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sina. I learned so much from your presentation, and I've read your thesis, your master's thesis, but it's really cool to hear you talk about it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share all that information that you've gathered and also your experiences. I was calculating, I think if you probably taught about 22,000 people about our emergence story and Wind Cave and the significance of that place. So, and I personally think it's so cool that you're a park ranger. I think we need both, right? We need we need people fighting on the outside, but we need people who are navigating those spaces on the inside.
Absolutely. So, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like people always ask me about a Standing Rock when I was a park ranger because it was so near. And I would say, listen to them, and I fully support what they're doing. So
yeah. And it's tough to navigate. But I really appreciate it. We got some affirmations from Facebook. Just Nancy Kyle says Bopila Tonka, and other folks just giving you affirmations there. So if anyone, I know we usually go an hour, but if anyone has questions or more comments, more affirmations in Facebook, just Mona says, great presentation. But if anyone has a question for Sina or anything that they would like to ask before we wrap it up, now is your time. And thank you those who joined us in the Zoom room. It looks like our relatives. That's one thing I like about, I feel like Native folks, their families always show up. Always the best. Just double checking. I know one thing, how do you feel? I know, right? Like Deb Haaland becoming the Secretary of Interior. How was that for you?
Gosh, it was amazing. Honestly, I was a little mad because I was like, what about me? When's it my turn? No, I'm kidding. But honestly, that was absolutely fantastic. And it's nice to not immediately feel distrust of your boss. That makes sense.
Yeah. And that my advisor was stating how cool it is to have, I mean, I know, right, we can critique these systems and these government, structures, but how cool it is to have someone in that position who was at Standing Rock, right, and understands like the complications that we face when we're trying to fight for our connection to place and our connection to these sites of relational significance. And so I think there are really cool things happening, and that will lessen the challenges that we have ahead. So I think we need more individuals like yourself who are willing to be in those spaces and take those chances.
And it's definitely not like for everyone. Am I very loud?
Yeah.
It's definitely not like a path I would recommend for everyone. Not that I don't think people can do it, but because it's very difficult to play this role in these spaces. Essentially, you are oftentimes the only voice to advocate for certain things. You feel alone a lot of the times, but if you can do it, it's important work for sure.
Awesome.
The house is just falling down right now.
I know, I love it. And to mention, right, you're in New York right now.
Yes, I'm in New York City currently. So I no longer work for Wind Cave. Since then, I have been at Matrotipila, Devil's Tower. I've been at the Grand Canyon, and now I'm in New York City at Gateway National Recreation Area, and this is Lenape land here.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, that is a nice thing. I've gotten to learn so much about so many different nations as I've moved around in the Park Service.
That's exciting. And I hope at being able to see how the other collaborations or other like conversations are going in those places. Yeah. Awesome. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. I'm going to wrap up our Facebook Live. Just again, thank you everyone who has joined us. Please share out the winter camp videos. They'll be accessible through Racing Magpie after the presentations are done. So it's a great time to refer back and be able to connect with the presenter that way. So thank you again, Sina.
Thank you, Clementine, and thank you, Racing Magpie.